Okay, so we're all set. So welcome. My name's Krista McCracken, and I'm here with Skylee-Storm Hogan, and we're going to be talking about the intersection of Indigenous knowledge and open educational resources. So I am speaking from Sault Ste. Marie, which is on the traditional territory of the Métis people and the Anishinaabe. And my background is really as a archivist and someone who is interested in public history and making information accessible. And I currently work in the Chinook Residential School Center.
I'm speaking from Ottawa, Ontario, the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. I'm originally from the Mohawk Nation of Ganawage, which is south of Montreal. It is on the St. Lawrence River. I work currently at No History Inc., which is a historical research consulting firm. And my experience with Indigenous knowledge is personal as well as academic and from an archivist and researcher perspective.
So we are going to dive into things by just kind of talking about some definitions. So thinking about what is Indigenous knowledge. So some of the phrasing and things that I've been taught is that it's ways of knowing, being, and doing. Skylee-Storm, do you want to talk a little bit about some perspectives on like what is Indigenous knowledge?
Yeah, for sure. So Indigenous knowledge can take many forms, as all knowledge can. It ranges from things like you see here, maple syrup harvesting and boiling and processing, which is a process, yes, but it's also, when you're talking from knowledge of an Indigenous context, you're also talking about things that are passed down through generations of people and have a very personal and meaningful relationship to not only themselves, but their community. Something like maple syrup boiling or harvesting or even governance is something that can be taught to you through stories about your family, about connections within the community, and really has a personal tie to how Indigenous people work together and live together on the land that they share.
That's a great explanation. And I love the maple syrup example because I think particularly maple syrup, it's something that we often think of as like a commercial product for Canada, but there can be really deep teachings around it and knowledge behind it
Of
too, I think.
course, and it marks the passage of time, which is also something incredibly important to us as we change seasons. We have a lot of ceremonies, as well as we have a lot of teachings that go along with those change of seasons, and maple syrup is a large part of that.
So thinking about, so we've talked about what indigenous knowledge is or can be, and thinking about how it might be shared. So shared in community, it's passed down through families. Do you want to talk a little bit about other ways it might be shared?
Yeah, it's definitely also shared through ceremony. So when people come together, they also have those conversations in those contexts, not really just around the kitchen table. It's also shared through traditional ceremonies and dance. It's shared through remembering, but also doing. So when somebody shows you how to do something or teaches you how to bead or how to process maple syrup, that's how Indigenous knowledge is shared. Because it's not just the process, it's all of those stories and all of those connections and things that come with it. So that's kind of my experience with it anyway.
Yeah, and my experience has been it can also be very place based and time of the year based, as you mentioned earlier. And I think honoring those pieces is really important. And I think that's actually kind of why we're talking about the intersection of Indigenous knowledge and open educational resources. So, at kind of the highest level, open educational resources are designed to make information open and accessible, free to the general public to be reused, remixed, reshared. But how can that work with Indigenous knowledge, or can it coexist. In some ways, maybe it can. In other ways, maybe there's knowledge that shouldn't be in the public domain, that shouldn't be shared with everybody. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, because of the legacy of colonialism as well as white supremacy and racism that we've had in North America, sharing Indigenous knowledge can be at times a little bit risky or a little bit dangerous, because there's been times in history where we've been encouraged to share and have had those things taken away. And it was okay to be used by non-Indigenous people, or something that is considered fun or fantasy or exotic, rather than something that actually is a part of somebody's life. And I think that certain knowledges, like how certain ceremonies are conducted, uh, certain rites of passage, things of that nature, probably should remain within the community, unless, you know, there's a special allowance being made for adoption protocols, or opening the community to someone who has demonstrated a reciprocal, meaningful connection to that community. I've also been in classes taught by Grand Chiefs. I've been in classes taught by knowledge keepers that, you know, we're very open with a lot of the different ways in which we view the world and a lot of the ways in which we navigate the world. And I think that having those types of things open to people does allow for a better understanding of who we are as a people, as opposed to how we are portrayed as a people. So I think it's finding the balance of sharing that knowledge, but making sure that it isn't being taken and given credit to someone that knowledge didn't come from, and that the original message of that knowledge stays integral to how it is written.
Yeah, and I think that's a really great point, like sharing based on community desires or community needs, not necessarily based on the needs of like a university or a settler who's just, or an academic who's trying to write a paper, but based on the desires of a community member. And actually, I think that actually kind of leads to the idea around maybe what are the best practices for sharing Indigenous knowledge, particularly, I think, online, and thinking about, you know, open knowledge, but also wanting to be cognizant of everything you just brought up around protocol and community guidance.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, when we're talking about online sharing, it's best usually to ask a community how much of the information can be shared. And I know sometimes when we do find resources online, we're not always sure who made them, or not always a clear path to trace back to the original author of those pieces. So, I mean, it's always good best practice to reach out to your local community and see what they know about that particular piece of knowledge, or know about what you're about to share, and see if they can offer some input on how much of that can be respectfully shared. I think too, it's best to not generalize people when we're sharing things online, but not get too specific into the practices surrounding knowledge. So sharing that ceremonies happen at certain points of the year and that they involve certain components is one thing, but describing how those ceremonies are done and the different meanings behind each object can maybe step over the boundary lines a little bit.
Yeah.
So it's kind of just trying to tread that line and figure out if we are sharing something that really should be kept for the people who are practicing, or if it's something that really is harmless enough to be shared with everyone. But it's always best to ask.
Yeah. And I think this is actually a conversation that I think you and I have had a couple times, particularly around archival holdings or museum holdings. So I'm thinking like ethnographic recordings where you had like a white researcher go into a community in the 1800s and make a bunch of audio recordings that maybe documented ceremony, language, traditional stories, and those materials are technically in the public domain now. And so I think that really brings up that ethical question around, okay, they're in the public domain, but we really need to think about like Indigenous intellectual property, as well as who should actually be allowed or be saying who gets to access that material.
Yeah, absolutely. And we also have to think about the context in which it was collected and whether or not those people really understood the far reaches of that content. I mean, at the time it was recorded, it was really only going to be shared with an academic community or like an anthropological society or an ethnography society. Now in the age of the internet, it's shared with billions of people online. So really thinking about the difference in that context and whether or not that community would have been okay with that is something that we have to revisit. And for a lot of communities, I'm sure some would be actually thankful to have those recordings in existence, because since those recordings, their community has either been forbade from practicing certain ceremonies, so then when they're able to do it again, they've forgotten certain things, or it may be interesting to see the community as it was in a different time. So there are positives and negatives to that, but it's just something that we have to think about if it's okay for us to be doing it in the context that we're doing it and what purpose it has, is usually what I try to think about when I'm sharing something.
I think that's a really great point. And the purpose and, you know, how that material is used, how you come to get material, or if you're creating an OER, how is it being made? What relationships are at play? Who is involved in those conversations? Both you and I work with community, and I know that's an important part of our work life and identity, but I know that's not the case for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have thoughts on like building reciprocal relationships and how that might play into sharing information online?
Of course. So in my work, usually if I'm working with community elders or if I'm working with the traditional knowledges of my community or another person's community, I usually try to make sure that I'm giving something back to them, as well as, because every time an academic goes into a community or every time you create content or something like that, it is helping you in some way, shape, or form. There really is no getting around that. Even though, like, I may be doing research on my own community, posting a blog about it or writing an article about it, that still furthers my reputation in the academic circle or in the historian community. So what am I giving back to my community? And oftentimes I'll think about, well, if I'm collecting oral histories or if I'm recording a conversation, I can clean up that conversation, edit it to make it very audible, and then send a high quality copy to my cultural center or to my community archive. So that way, when those elders have passed, their families can still access those conversations and hear the words of their ancestors. So I think stuff like that is very important. I think giving credit in your publications or in your, I guess, for lack of a better word, product deliverables or things that you're making within the public history sphere, exhibitions, if you give credit to the community that it comes from, and more specifically the elder that it comes from, I try to give them as much credit as I can, almost like they're like a co-author or something, so like I make it a big point, like, this elder was instrumental in my research, or this person was the key to what I've written here, and not make it all about me or make it all about my organization. I try to make it about the people themselves who hold that information. And I think that that's key in a reciprocal relationship. Also, just making sure that if any needs by them are expressed during the process, doing your best to meet those needs or find a way that they can get something in return.
Yeah, I think meeting those needs, as someone who works in a university, thinking about the fact that if you want to create reciprocal relationships, they maybe shouldn't be based on your research priorities, because your priorities might not be the same as community. So say you're thinking about creating a open educational resource around plant life and looking to include Indigenous knowledge in that. That's great. I think that's a valuable, contribution. But is that something the community wants, or the community that you're hoping to work with wants? I think those are big questions that maybe need to happen at the start when you're doing that relationship building piece.
Absolutely. And if you're starting research on a particular topic that you find interesting and you go into the community to ask about it and the community doesn't want you to work on it, that's usually just a sign that maybe you should pick something else. And as much as that sucks because like you really had your heart set on it, if it's not yours, then you really can't continue. And I've worked with a lot of people who will try to work around that and see how they can still get their project done, but without the community being involved because they said no. And I think that that's very underhanded, and it's kind of undoing that idea of reciprocal relationships and open exchange of Indigenous knowledge, because that causes further distrust. And I think being open and being honest about what you're planning on doing with that knowledge is a big part of reciprocal relationship.
Yeah, I would completely agree. So I think it's kind of like some closing thoughts. So Skylee-Storm and I have worked on a longer white paper that's around the intersection of Indigenous knowledge and open educational resources, and looking, kind of across Canada, the landscape. Do you want to share a little bit about just some high-level thoughts on that?
Yeah, for sure. I know that we kind of had a few discussions on the lack of
Yeah.
available open educational resources. Like there are some great ones, but at the same time, we've kind of noticed that there's a big disparity between non-Indigenous open education and Indigenous open education. And a lot of that, I think, does come from maybe some fear of offending or fear of misstepping, or really just not doing that first initial ask. So, I mean, looking at those items that are out there and how it can be best shared, really those answers lie with the community themselves. And I think that a good step to getting more open education resources would be to kind of ask communities, you know, do you want these things? Can we make these things? And what type of things can we share with the wider community that is non-Indigenous that could help move things a bit more forward?
Yeah, I think that's an awesome point. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for watching, and thank you, Skylee-Storm, for talking. And we will definitely share the link to the white paper once it comes out in March. Take care, folks.
Bye. Thank you.